potential changes are on the cards in regards to the father-son rule this coming AFL draft, which is set to take effect in November, which is potentially set to affect two clubs vying for that number one selection for respectively Carlton and Port Adelaide, with two up-and-coming players, Cody Walker, the son of Andrew Walker, the 200 gamer, and Dougie Cochran, a 196cm utility, the son of Stuart Cochran. That and so much more here on the latest episode of Out on the Fall through Scoreboard Media. Welcome back to another episode. My name is Juri and unfortunately I don't have my co-host with me, Woody from Wooden Spoon Data, to chat all the latest in what has been happening in the AFL and look ahead to this long Easter weekend of matches with GWS and St Kilda having the bye. But we'll continue this episode on solo, and hopefully Woody will be back with us next week and has a speedy recovery from the latest bout of the flu. We'll start first off with that latest news that did transpire these last few days, which was first reported by SEN chief football reporter Sam Edmund as into regards to those changes, looking into potentially now how for clubs that do have a upcoming player through father-son eligibility, that they may have to pay a little bit more to get them. And that is the case with what may happen for both Carlton and Port Adelaide, with Cody Walker and Dougie Cochran, both highly regarded going into the 2026 draft, both most likely to be top 5 draft picks. And it's a really fascinating stage because the father-son product for a long period of time, and we've seen it since 1949, how many brilliant players have come through the father-son ranks. Of course, with Essendon, Dustin Fletcher played 400 games for the club from 1993 to 2015, the son of Ken Fletcher, and just the amount of spark he brought to the Bombers. And it's not always going to be every father-son turns out to be a star or superstar player. There's always going to be hits and misses, but for our great game, I think that's what separates it from other sporting codes around the world. Unless, of course, with the NBA, what we saw a couple of drafts ago with Bronny James, the son of LeBron James, the longest tenured ever NBA player, and would call himself the GOAT in his own mind, of any LeBron James fans' minds. But apart from that, we don't see it in any other league across the world. And it's one of those unique elements of the game of AFL where we can see an upcoming player whose dad played 100 plus games for the club live out their dream. And we saw that, right, only the best part of 12 years ago, the 2014 draft. Darcy Moore, the son of Peter Moore, one of the elite backs of his time. And we've seen the career that Darcy's been able to cave out for himself, starting as a forward and moving to the back line and becoming a premiership player, and not just a premiership player, but a captain. And that's what in itself is so great about having this, is that players can almost look back once their careers are over and say to themselves, that was something that I actually immensely enjoyed. And we've seen that right now, the Dacos brothers, Josh Dacos, who was, I think, pick 57 in 2016, Nick Dacos, pick 4 in 2021, and what they are currently doing at the moment for the Collingwood Football Club and following in the footsteps of their legendary father, Peter, and doing so many brilliant exploits on the football field, particularly with Nick, and what he's already done in 5 seasons of footy already is just truly astounding. So these are instances we can't take for granted, and hopefully these changes, which are set to take effect in November's draft, don't go ahead as planned, because otherwise it'd almost be to the detriment of what the league has been about for such a long period of time and what makes it so great. And we've seen that with many other players, and we've seen that with a couple of upcoming Richmond players at the moment, including Archie Daffy, the son of former Richmond 1998 Jack Dye medalist too, Nick Daffy. And these are things I think just kids dream about for a long period of time. When you put on the football boots for the very first time, you run out into the field as, say, a young 6-7-year-old, and you get the opportunity to potentially live out your dream. And it's one of those surreal feelings, I think, for players that have had this lifelong ambition to play in the league. And that's what Cody's currently going through at the moment. And we saw, I think only yesterday in The Age with Jake Null, their chief football reporter, and Graham Wright, the Blues CEO, saying that we may have to pay overs and we may have to go into draft debt to get Cody Walker, which I think is almost a travesty in itself, considering that he's pretty much wanted to play for the Blues his whole life. He's nominated Carlton as his club of choice. His dad, Andrew, played 200 games for the club from 2004 to 2016. And I think a long time ago, in 2014, there was an interview where I think Cody was only about 8 or 9 years old. And there was a short little video doing a tour around Andrew Walker's place. And his son was asked about wanting to represent the Carlton Football Club. And pretty much his affirmative answer was yes, that he wanted to and follow in his dad's footsteps. So I can't see why not that would go ahead. And just, I think, to almost tie this up, that it's a really grand, unique part of this game. And for teams, and we've seen that now with the Western Bulldogs, Riley West, who has been following in his dad's footsteps, Scott West, who, of course, is one of the Bulldogs' legends of all time, a 7-time Charles Sutton medal winner for the club's Best and Fairest award, and what he's been able to pave his way now as a dangerous small forward after seeing himself initially as a midfielder, but be able to embrace a new role now and come into his own. So it's one of those exciting things about father-son rules. And I go back to this from a couple of minutes ago, in that not every father-son is going to turn out to be a 100-game player. I think we saw that with Ace Cordy in the late 2000s. I think he had about 4 seasons with the Western Bulldogs, and unfortunately it didn't quite materialise. We saw his brother Zane, of course, be part of that Western Bulldogs 2016 flag, the side's first premiership in 62 years. I think then as a young 20-year-old, and the career he was out to conjure out, firstly for the Western Bulldogs and then for a few seasons at St Kilda. So we'll get further more details on this too when it does further transpire to light as to what happens looking forward. But hopefully, for the sake of it, that this will continue the father-son tradition of the AFL, because it's so just paramount in how the game goes about, and be able to almost continue the next part of the club, well, not just the club's legacy, but also the family legacy too, to whichever club it may be for an Essendon, Carlton, Collingwood, Richmond, West Coast, Fremantle. The list goes on in regards to that. We'll move on now from that particular news, and we'll get started into the round 4 games, the Easter long weekend, and it's been a really interesting opening month so far, this 2026 AFL home and away season, which begins on Thursday night, the traditional Easter Thursday clash between Brisbane and Collingwood up at the Gabba. And the Magpies haven't had any fears of playing up north against the Lions there. They've won the last couple of Easter Thursday clashes, and they've done it in sort of alternative different ways, Collingwood. And that's what's been most impressive with the last 2 matchups at the Gabba. And what Craig McRae said in his weekly press conference is that it's almost sort of a home and away from home, which it probably does sound a little bit weird, but when you've had recent success there, you'll definitely take it 110%. And last Friday night against the Giants, the Magpies were able to rectify a few things which had eluded them for the first couple of games, the 450 connectivity, which was a little bit of an issue. They were able to get that going early on against the Giants, but the most dominant aspect, I think, was their work from centre clearances, and to be able to generate that from score, which is one of the most least areas that teams score from. And the Magpies were able to generate 27 points from centre bounces pretty much against GWS, which I think was really prolific. And you see how clean they were away from it. Jordan De Goey, Nick Dacos, who had a best on ground performance, and it's most likely Jared Berry will play on him. And I think a couple of years ago when the Magpies did travel up to Brisbane, he pretty much towed him up, and did the same thing last year, racking up 38 touches and kicking a goal. So there's probably at least a couple of areas, if you're a Magpie supporter going into this against Brisbane, that you can potentially exploit them in. One is pressure, which has always been a renowned part of Coach Craig McRae's system. Forward half pressure, maintaining a lot of the possession in your forward half and allowing your smalls to weave their magic in there. Lockie Schultz, who is one of the prime examples of someone that may not hit the scoreboard with regularity, but is so vital for how Collingwood are able to lock the ball up rather inside their forward 50. So his role is going to be extremely prominent there for the Magpies. And you look at a couple of years ago when they did win that Easter Thursday clash by 20 points, the number of tackles the Magpies applied that night, I think it was plus 32 in tackles at 85 to Brisbane's 53. Last season, it was sort of more, the tackling pressure sort of averted away, but they were able to at least get a hand around stoppages and that and score from their back half, which I think is also going to be another element for the Magpies. If they can at least make Brisbane defend, because the Lions are so good of covering for one another and shutting out those areas, because once Brisbane gets back possession, they can play their kick mark game, which they're so renowned for. But we saw last week how St Kilda were able to put pressure on them for 3 and a bit quarters until the Lions were able to kick away in the last half of the game. Is that if they maintain it for sufficient periods of time, then I think they have every chance of winning this, the Magpies. And you almost look at now their forward setup, and of course with Brodie Mychek now at Melbourne, Mason Cox at Fremantle, that they've almost had to alternate things a little bit on the go, and it could almost look similar to what they did when they made the grand final 2018, that there isn't such a sole dependency on its tall forwards to kick a bag of goals, but through midfield there, we can see Jack Crisp who can kick 2-3 goals on any given day, and he's probably one of those really ultra consistent players for Collingwood that doesn't get the recognition outside the four walls of the club for the work he does. We saw the first opening round against St Kilda, he played across half back in his last couple of weeks, been playing along the wing, and he's such an efficient ball user and one of those guys that can also break the lines extremely well and doesn't tend to waste the ball by foot that much. So that's going to be a big part of Collingwood's game plan, is can they lock the ball enough in their forward half and create perceived pressure on Brisbane and not allow them to waltz out so easily from their back 50. That's the two areas that you're looking for Collingwood if they are to bank home the 4 points against the Lions at the Gabba. And Brisbane were able to overcome that slow start against the Saints, and they tried a couple of new things, with Ty Gallop playing down back with Harris Andrews still having one more match to serve from his 3-game ban for that bump on Western Bulldogs Archie Jones during the opening round clash against the Western Bulldogs. And they played Kadeem Coleman up forward for the first half, and he gave them something there because they were struggling a little bit, the Brisbane Lions. And we saw that with Lachie Neale and him being tagged away from the game by Hugo Garcia, is that they have so much midfield depth to Lions that if Neale's quiet, then we'll see Josh Dunkley play a prominent role. And he's most likely going to get that again, whether it's on the Nick Dacos, even though I think Dunkley said prior to the game against St Kilda that he does lack that leg speed when it came to Wanganeen Malira, although the Lions did change that game plan around by the second half to at least curtail Wanganeen Malira's influence throughout the contest. So that's another area I think the Brisbane Lions could well pull the lever on if Nick Dacos does get hot early on. For Collingwood, though, when you look back at it now, and the other area, I think that probably makes it a little bit more threatening now, is putting Bo McCleary almost on a permanent basis around stoppages and on the outside. And there were a couple of promising plays that he showed against the Giants last Friday night. There was a follow-up play on the middle of the ground where he didn't lose his feet, but he kept track of where the ball was going and pretty much followed it up, even though it didn't eventuate in a goal. It's those particular aspects, I think, that Collingwood were looking for a little bit of more vigour in a way to complement Nick Dacos. And Dacos, of course, has brilliant speed on the outside when you give him time and space. And McCreary is one of those players, I think, for Collingwood now that we've seen since he entered the league in 2021 that forward half pressure has always been his norm. But the Magpies these last couple of seasons have seen a different light to putting McCreary in the middle and giving these different, almost this complementary piece for the Magpies for how they want to attack. And he has definitely shown that through these first couple of games for Collingwood. So that's another area I think for Brisbane too that they'll definitely have to keep a watch on, because he doesn't need a lot of disposals to punish teams on the scoreboard, whether it's kicking a goal or whether it's been part of a scoring chain for a score involvement. So those are a couple of little facets to keep a watch on too for this contest. But I think it's going to be a really close encounter. I think Brisbane may just have enough to get over the line with Collingwood to be without Darcy Moore for the next month with that hamstring injury and Scott Pendlebury with Achilles tightness. So I think the Lions should narrowly get the job done in this one for the Easter Thursday clash. We'll move ahead now to a doubleheader on Good Friday, the first one which takes place between North Melbourne and Carlton at Marvel Stadium. And it's been a long time for the Roos since they last beat the Blues in general, not just in general. Of course, we saw last year beating at the MCG, but at Docklands where they last beat the Blues back in round 19 of 2021. And Alistair Clarkson spoke about this post-game for his Roos during the second half where the game was being played at a helter-skelter pace against Essendon, and North Melbourne did extremely well to defend the amount of forward half entries the Bombers were getting. I think it was 32 in the first half, and in total it was 52 to restrict them to only 9 goals. But it was that last quarter which they almost ran out of petrol tickets because of the amount of quick ball that they wanted to play to Kangaroos. And we saw that they were able to get those handball chains out and going along the wings, bring their forwards up, and then hurt Essendon going the other way. And that's where Colby McKercher comes into place, Harry Sheasel, also George Wardlaw's first game of the season, Dylan Stephens, who was arguably North Melbourne's best player against Port Adelaide in the first round, that if you give these guys an open space to attack from, then they're extremely dangerous. And I think that's the part of the game for this that you're looking towards, is that if North Melbourne can avert away from it being a contested style of game, which Carlton's been pretty much their blueprint since Michael Voss came to the helm in 2022, is that they can take away that part and force it to be an uncontested game, then I think they'll probably have too many legs into that particular regard. And then as for Carlton, well, the second halves of this has just been a sort of an ongoing conundrum for as long as it has been going, right? You cop up a 43-point lead to Melbourne overall in the game. You're leading at 1.7244 to one behind. And there are probably times where they are going to have to play a little bit almost at a slow tempo to almost alleviate when teams do get on a roll, the Blues. So it's a really interesting dynamic to how it all does play out. But I think for the Blues, they won't have to contend with Tristan Sherry, who is currently now going to serve his 3-match suspension for that incident with Essendon skipper Andrew McGrath. So I think you look at the ruck dimensions there. Callum Coleman-Jones, who played last week, will shoulder the number 1 ruck mantle up against Mark Pittner, who's been one of Carlton's best so far through these first 3 matches. So that particular area, I think, is to keep a watch on. But for Carlton, is locking the ball up inside their forward 50. You look at second half against Melbourne last week, and there were too many times where the ball rebounded so easily out of Melbourne's back 50, and they were able to launch their attacks from there through hands and getting a wave of players through there. And then you almost see, well, what happened with Keziah Pickett and his stellar performance. 33 disposals, 10 score involvements, 6 clearances, kicked 1 goal, 3. That could have easily been 3 or 4 goals all up, and 834 metres gained. They tried George Hewitt on him. They tried Sam Walsh on him. It just didn't seem to prevail. And North Melbourne have a litany of players now that can hurt you. So if a Sheedle does start to get rolling, or Dylan Stephens, or one of those guys, I think it's going to be extremely difficult when you look at it. And Finn O'Sullivan now, who's been given numerous tagging roles, and the job he did on Zach Merritt last Saturday night, holding him to only 10 disposals. I think probably a matchup on Patrick Cripps, the Blue skipper, maybe even throw him onto Sam Walsh at times, Jagger Smith. So I think North Melbourne, when you look at the midfield, I think it's going to be really close. There's probably no separating this at the moment. And then also last year's encounter, just the physicality stakes that they showed after quarter time. They pretty much ruffled Carlton up in every single facet almost just played this back to the shin bone of spirit, which was so prevalent during the 1990s when they won those two flags in 1996 and 1999, is that almost just ruffled Carlton up. And we saw that. I think there was a big bump during the third quarter of Cam Zurhaar and George Hewitt, and pretty much just flattened him on his backside and left Carlton's last season's B&F winner pretty much on his haunches for the best part of 2 minutes. So they were able to do that. And then on the outside, when it did get out there, they'll pretty much just be able to waltz by too easily. So this game, I think, will go down to the wire, but it's one to keep an eye out for second halves for the Blues, of course, how they approach this, especially when the pressure does get placed upon them. And then for North Melbourne, if they are slowed down to almost a standstill, how they're able to cope with that particular pressure too. So those are just a few little sections to keep an eye out for the Blues and Roos clash under the roof at Docklands. We'll move now to the second doubleheader, which takes place at the Adelaide Oval between Adelaide and Fremantle. The Dockers, of course, had a slow start in the first half to Richmond, but were able to overpower them by 60 points in the end, despite kicking inaccurate 13 goals, 25, 103. And Adelaide did pretty well after quarter time against Geelong. They were pretty much dominated in that first term. All the ball was in their defensive 50 and had real difficulty exiting from their back half. And when you take on top, the conditions weren't the most pleasant as well, with rain consistently being a feature of the game, and notably late in the first half, is that they're able to rectify a few passes. Despite not having Jordan Dawson, their skipper, due to a calf injury, he's likely to return for the encounter. Taylor Walker, who was managed, Rory Laird, who's likely to return from his own injury, is that Adelaide were able to run a few plays through the midfield, and Josh Rochelli, who had spent a few stints on ball last season, was Adelaide's best player last Thursday night and gave them that extra dimension through the midfield where his ball use going forward was incredibly elite. And that's, I think, going to be a really important part for Adelaide, is to break the lines against his Fremantle defence, which under Justin Longmuir have defended extremely well yet again and are in the top 5 for points allowed. I think it's only 74 points per game they concede on average. Is that Adelaide will have to take risks, and I think it was a part that Matthew Nick spoke about after the loss to the Western Bulldogs when they trailed, I think, at one point by 5 goals and left their run a little bit too late, is that they were probably a little bit too conservative with their ball movement, and you can't have that against the Dockers, who set up so well in their back 50 and have numbers behind the ball, allow skipper Alex Pearce to marshal troops and put players in their certain positions, and allow for Luke Ryan, Brendan Cox to be third man up and peel away from their man to help and intercept or kill the ball over the boundary line for a boundary thrown. Is Adelaide can't allow that to happen. And then you look at the tagging situation that teams have done on Fremantle. We saw Caleb Sarong in round 2. Melbourne put Colton Tolstrip on him. The last Saturday at Optus Stadium, the Tigers went after Andrew Brayshaw and held him to 21 disposals, but yet kicked a goal. And it was Caleb Sarong this time doing the damage with 32 disposals and kicking a couple of goals. Is that if you hold either one of Sarong or Brayshaw week in, week out, is that someone else of one of those two rather will get you. So that's probably a most important part for Adelaide, is to somehow shut down both their players' influences, because Fremantle's midfield is batting deep right now. We see Shea Bolton's first 3 games this season and just how instrumental he's been, just like giving them that dimensional burst through the middle of the ground, which he did so well in his first season last year in Fremantle. Matthew Johnson, who had a career best season last year, he can also play in and under in a few tagging roles, predominantly though he's been playing wing yet again to start this season. That they've got an abundance of options, Fremantle, to throw through there. So that may be a little bit of a concern for Adelaide going into the contest. And Fremantle's forward half pressure, I think that's probably a really profound aspect of the game. And why they've been so successful so far to start the year when you're leading the league in points in forward half at 61.7 points per game. Isaiah Dudley, who's had a tremendous start to the season, right? Just not only the amount of goals he's kicked already, but his forward half pressure and also his ability to find teammates without blazing away. I think that's a really instrumental part with Fremantle's small forwards. Him, Sam Switkowski in there, Murphy Reid, who's sort of splitting half and half now between his time up forward and on ball, is that they have great vision going forward and don't waste the ball too often. So Adelaide definitely have to be on a watch for that and don't allow Fremantle small forwards latitude to do whatever they want going forward. And then Josh Tracy started the season 10 goals through the first 3 games, and the wet conditions against Richmond last week didn't seem to deter him when you have 12 marks, kick 4 goals, I think 6 marks inside 50, and Fremantle love to use him as that outlet option when they exit from their back 50, and he tends to be almost his, not quite the bailout kick, but just another option to go down the wing and pretty much kick it to a contest. And if he doesn't mark it, then he'll bring the ball to ground, and it's such a vital part of Fremantle's game, and then it allows their smalls to crime at ground level because Fremantle tend to bring them high up the ground. Chris Sherry, who had a great debut against Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, mentioned Murphy Reid, Isaiah Dudley there, Sam Switkowski. So it's a really dangerous aspect, I think, that Adelaide will have to keep a watch on. And the other part of this is that the Crows won't have Jordan Butts yet again, who sustained concussion in a marking contest with a head collision with one of his teammates, is that he would have had the job on Josh Tracy in this encounter, and the work he did in holding Sam Darcy to a single goal. Adelaide are sorely going to miss that. So you think Fremantle may have the ascendancy in this one, although they haven't won at the Adelaide Oval since 2022. But I think when you look at how all the matchups are to be played out in this one, I think it's going to be extremely close, and probably Adelaide, I think, narrowly will get this one done, but it wouldn't surprise me one bit whatsoever if Fremantle end up prevailing in this encounter. We'll now move on to the first game on Saturday, which takes place at the MCG between Richmond and Port Adelaide. The Power coughing up that early 5-goal lead to the West Coast Eagles, losing by a couple of points. And the Tigers, yet again, were competitive for the first half and then just unfortunately fell away in the end to the Dockers, losing by 10 goals. And when you look at this encounter, right, Port Adelaide have won the last 5 over Richmond. The Tigers last beating Port Adelaide in round 21 of 2022. For Richmond, the ruck situation, that's going to be a pretty interesting watch. Samson Ryan, who got through a VFL game last weekend, is most likely in contention to ruck against Jordan Sweet, who's been one of Port Adelaide's best players and has done a lot of work, sees his opportunity after getting limited time at the Western Bulldogs, of course, with Tim English and him securing that number 1 ruck mantle. So I think for Port Adelaide, a lot of it too with them is playing with speed, and for the Tigers, it's almost trying to slow the game down at times and make it a real contest, because I think that's the different elements of what Port Adelaide have within their midfield compared to Richmond's with Tim Taranto, Jacob Hopper in there, Jack Ross, is that they're more in and under players. But when it comes to the outer for Port Adelaide with Zach Butters, Jason Horne-Francis, despite not having skipper Connor Rosé, who's out for the next 3 months with a high-grade hamstring injuries, that I think that's where Port Adelaide's opportunity lies, is if they're able to break away from stoppages and give Mitch Georgiades those one-on-one opportunities, because when they did that early on against West Coast, that's when they were super damaging and be able to isolate him. And I think for Richmond, when Fremantle did lock the ball in their forward half, is when they started to break down and the Dockers were able to set pretty much up their defensive structures behind the ball, which makes it very difficult to counteract for the Tigers. So you think most likely that Port Adelaide's going to win this one? You'd expect with how it is all shaping out, but expect the Tigers to remain competitive for an opening half. And then if they are able to maintain close proximity with Port Adelaide for 3/4, then I think they're every chance of winning a game. But it's just going to be probably a bit tad difficult at the moment with their forward structure at this stage, with Tom Lynch, of course, being out with a hamstring injury and having to rely on numerous youngsters, including Jonty Fall, to at least kick a big bag of goals for the Tigers to get up in this one. Now we'll proceed ahead to the other game on Saturday, which takes place at Optus Stadium between West Coast and Sydney. The Eagles coming off that 2-point win over Port Adelaide, and the Sydney Swans having the bye after losing to Hawthorn by 17 points at the MCG. The Swans are to get superstar Isaac Heaney back from his hamstring injury, which he sustained against Brisbane in the first round, and West Coast will be without Devon Robertson, who accepted his one-match suspension for his dangerous tackle on Port Adelaide Zach Butters, and Elliot Yeo, who had an outstanding game for 3/4 last week. Unfortunately, he suffered an abductor injury and will be out for the next 1 to 2 weeks. But it was really interesting a couple of weeks ago when Andrew McQualter was asked during his post-game interview after the win over North Melbourne. They came back from a 5-goal deficit, win by 17 points. They replicate the same thing last week against Port Adelaide after being jumped in the first quarter. Is that, have they established an identity of how they want to play? And I think we're starting to see that now through this first month of the season, is that when they can get enough ball on the outside, and a lot of it's going to do with their kicking game to get it onto the outer, is that they can be super efficient in that. And there is probably now less reliance on Harley Reid, and that's probably the biggest worry the first couple of seasons, is that leave it so much on Harley Reid's shoulders and having to move into half back because the amount of opposition attention that he was getting, is that now the Eagles can spread it around with their midfield rotations, with Jack Graham in there, who arguably is West Coast's best pressure player too, and he led the Eagles last week for most pressure acts, I think, with 34 in total against the Power. And he also just had these other facets there. Tim Kelly, who had a solid game last week for them. Liam Baker, you think, probably gets a bit more midfield time with Yo being out now for these next 1 to 2 weeks. So they can put players through there now, the Eagles, and just give these different array of options to trouble sides, hopefully, going forward. And William Dersmer, who won the Rising Star nominee for round 3, and his creativity on the wing and be able to provide this other outlet option going forward is, I think there's a lot of promise there when you look at the whole midfield and wing components. And you have Bo Allen, who I think that's probably one of the focal points for the Eagles on the outside. They can get the ball in his hands a lot more because he's super damaging on the outside. His run and carry, and he combined on top having a silky left foot and not missing too many targets going forward. It's a pretty dangerous combination that the Eagles do have. And you look for Sydney, just I think the number of times they did break down against Hawthorn probably was a concern for them in that second half. And they just weren't able to quite get the game on their terms. So that probably, to at least see how they do rectify that, Sydney, and having Heaney back will definitely help. But midfield rotations for them, still with Gordon being out with that shoulder injuries, that they're pretty much going to have to adjust on the fly. We saw Justin McInerney being at least a difference maker for them with his speed bursting away from congestion. So it's almost a counteracting measure for how both teams are going to play. And for the West Coast Eagles, they're working stoppages and translating that into scores. I think that's been the biggest improvement so far in season 2026, after being absolutely dismal in that regard last season, averaging only 21 points. And they've pretty much doubled that this season at 40 points per game. So if they're able to lock the ball in their forward half, get scores from stoppages and scores from turnovers, which they've been better at, then I think they're every chance of winning this game. So keep an eye on this one too for how it all does pan out, because I think there's a lot of intriguing matchups in this particular contest. And for West Coast, how do they stop with Sydney's three-pronged forward attack with Joel Marty, Charlie Curnow and also Logan McDonald up there. We'll take a quick break here out on the full here through Scoreboard Media, and then after this we'll continue our preview for the matches for round 4, looking ahead to Melbourne Gold Coast, also Western Bulldogs Essendon, and then the Easter Monday traditional clash between Hawthorn and Geelong.